So I'm going to create an example video for you that kind of outlines what you should be talking about when it comes to your piece of technology. In this case, I'm using John Kay's The Flying Shuttle, which was a huge invention that basically revolutionized the textile industry and really kind of launched the industrial revolution. So what we've got here is, in order to make a piece of cloth previous to this invention, everything was basically done by hand. You can kind of see these women here, and this is still being done in parts of the world today, and in many parts of the world it's being done this way as kind of a craft for people who want handcrafted goods and those kinds of things. But the process is exactly the same. This is a very slow process. It takes a lot of skill to be able to craft textiles with certain patterns and colors and things in this way, because you have to do everything by hand, and you got to weave each piece of thread individually. So as a result, it was very slow and laborious, lots of low production in terms of how much cloth you could make in a single day, or in a week, or even a month in this case. And so what people did is they did this to basically outfit themselves. Whatever they had left over, they would they would take that to market, local markets that were held maybe once a year, or craft fairs that were held maybe once a year, and this is where they hoped to make all their money. There were lots of people employed in these kinds of industries because this was one of the main kinds of things you did. You grew food and you tried to live off of that, and then you weaved if you grew cotton or something like that, and hoped to make a little bit of money to buy some other things that you might need. And it was kind of a subsistence farming type lifestyle. But lots of people needed to do these kinds of things, clearly, because you couldn't produce that many things rapidly on your own. And so lots of people were employed in doing these kinds of things. The flying shuttle, now John Kay's invention, really kind of revolutionized this, because they started to use a machine to be able to do what used to be done by hand. Increased production greatly. You could now do the work of 6 people, let's say, in order to produce cloth. And so it sort of revolutionized the way the textile industry, which at the time was one of the main industries in the world during the Industrial Revolution. So this was a big deal. So I'm going to play this video for you, and it'll give you an idea of what the flying shuttle does and how it works, and what that was like. And yes, this is Mr. Weasley from Harry Potter that you'll see.
This is woolen thread. And this is a frame loom. It's very basic. This is the warp running up and down, and the weft crosses it. So, to weave, you pass the weft up and over each of the warps. It does the job, but it is, as you can see, a very time-consuming and very laborious. And if you're a big strapping Yorkshireman trying to keep your family, it's no good. So, when this came along, weavers could actually make a living out of their craft. This is the hand loom, and represents a significant improvement. Same principle. Here's the warp, and the weft goes through. But this loom got a piece of kit invented in 1733 by one John Kay that doubled the output of these looms, and it was this. The Flying Shuttle. Only not very flying. So instead of throwing the shuttle through the warp, you can now just whack it across. And the weavers would keep it in the family. The children carding, the women winding bobbins and spinning, and the men up here weaving. You can see how big the windows were. They'd want as much natural light as possible for these fine yarns.
So I'm going to stop it there, but it does a pretty good job, I think, of showing you how using a machine really increased your production. They, like you said, they kept it in the family, but you could really increase what you could do before you. Now, the future of weaving and what we kind of even see today, rooms full of giant machines, does all of it for you. You don't need to work any of this yourself. And obviously, you're going to have much, much greater production, much greater ability to make better designs, colors, all of those kinds of things. These machines, they'll run 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so your production goes massively, massively up as a result. You can also get better quality, and that usually translates into what we call thread counts. So when you go down to Bed Bath & Beyond and you're looking for sheets, right? If you get 100 thread count sheets, it's pretty rough, it's pretty coarse, not very soft. And but if you go into the 300 to 500 thread count sheets, that means per square inch, that's how many pieces of thread you're getting per square inch. And it's really tough to do by hand, but with machines that can be much more accurate, pull things tighter, you get these greater thread counts that are much more soft, much more strong, those kinds of things, greater designs, all that kind of stuff. And so that really is, if we're talking about the future of weaving, that's kind of where we've come since the Flying Shuttle as a result of that. Now, you have to make a choice. Is this going to have a negative impact or a positive impact? You could argue both. In this case, I'm going to argue that the Flying Shuttle has had a negative impact overall. So, in terms of the economic negative impact, right, we've got slavery. As a result of the Flying Shuttle and the industrialization of the textile industry, what you end up with is people needing to produce cotton at much, much greater amounts in order to support the ability to produce a lot more textiles, right, and weaving and cloth and those kinds of things. And so you started to see colonies being set up in the Americas and the Caribbean and those kinds of places in order to create cotton farms. And in order for that, you needed labor. And so as a result, you had slavery. Now, that had the slave trade itself had an economic benefit to those involved in the slave trade, but it's hard to argue that slavery of itself was a positive thing for many, many people around the world. You also ended up with what are pretty low-skilled jobs. People who did these things by hand were fine craftsmen, and the better that they were at those skills, the higher they could charge for their product. Today, especially what you see in places like Bangladesh, where the textile industry is pretty strong, is extremely low-skilled jobs, extremely low paying. And so people do one thing over and over and over again, and they may be good at sewing a collar onto a t-shirt, but that's what they do all day long. And if they don't want to do those things, or they don't agree with the wages they're getting or the working conditions, there's thousands of other people waiting to take those jobs. And so it doesn't take a lot of skill. They don't pay a lot. And so that's really kind of had a negative impact in some of those countries because they're not paying living wages and those kinds of things. What we also see from, as the start of the textile industry being industrialized and really kind of starting the Industrial Revolution is there's a bigger gap between the wealthy and the poor. And you can kind of see here that there wasn't a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. There certainly was a gap, but people just lived to survive. And the wealthy, sure, they had more money, but they weren't living much, much greater lives than anybody else. There wasn't that kind of great technology. But as you start to see technology increase, everybody's economic status kind of went up a little bit. So there was some positive effects to it. But you can see the wealthy who were able to own those factories, own the means of production, really started to make tons and tons more money, and you really started to see a greater disparity between the wealthy who owned everything and the poor who basically had to work for the wealthy in those factories and doing those kinds of things. So I would argue that economically overall it's had sort of a negative impact on the poor because the rich never really shared that wealth with the poor. In terms of the social negative impacts, what we first start to see is known as the enclosure movement. As land became more valuable to grow more cotton and wool and those kinds of things in order to make cloth, it really kind of kicked the family farms off of this land that used to be kind of communal land, and everybody kind of shared it and let their cattle or their sheep graze on those pieces of land. And so what you ended up with were literally enclosing with walls or fences the land, so that way the common folk could not work that land anymore, and they didn't have access to it. And so the wealthy owned all of this, which basically forced family farms off of that land, and those family farms or those families had to make a choice of where they were going to go to get jobs at this point. And so what you see is factories start to get set up in areas near waterways and in the cities where the trade was. And so then those family farmers had to move to where those jobs were, which were those factories. And so they kind of lost that skill of being able to grow food and survive as a family based on what they were able to produce to, I better go get a job in one of these factories in one of these low skilled areas in order to make money, in order to provide for my family now. So that really kind of changed things. It also led to urbanization, right? Everybody moving into these cities or these towns, and things growing up around these different factories, and this is where the jobs were. And so you started to see a massive influx of people moving from the countrysides out into what are now known as these cities. And you started to have all kinds of issues around that with poor living conditions, people being crammed into areas and low-skilled jobs, not a lot of food. The sanitation was really bad in those areas. So it became kind of a really negative, tough thing for people to deal with socially. And so I would argue that the social movement was really tough for people because it really kind of forced people off of this communal living to kind of fending for themselves in these big cities where it was really kind of tough economically for them. In terms of the environment, what we started to see were these mega farms. And what we see today, especially here in California, is people are, because of technology, are growing crops in places that probably shouldn't be growing crops. If you go out to the Imperial Valley, that place is basically a desert, but you see these massive mega farms, and you can see that here. Well, they use tons and tons and tons of water just to grow crops that probably never should really grow in those environments. You should be using crops that grow using low water amounts because you're basically in a desert, and instead we're growing things that take tons of water. And so you really put a strain on the water supply in those regions. You also got poor sanitation. A lot of these urban centers didn't have sewage systems or weren't set up to deal with the massive amounts of people moving into them. And as a result, people dumped their feces out windows, they dumped their trash out on the roads, and that's what people lived by and walked on. And you could imagine the amount of disease that came with that as a result of poor sanitation, and that is not good for the environment. Also, with all these factories near rivers and you're dyeing cloth and all that kind of stuff, you have to use those chemicals that allow you to create those colors and those kinds of things. You got to dump it somewhere, and they just dumped it straight into the waterways. And the waterways is where people got their fish. It was where they got their drinking water, their cooking water, where they cleaned up. And so those waterways became unbelievably polluted to the point where some of them were basically known as what we call dead rivers, where nothing really could grow or survive in those things. And those became extremely dangerous, and that's obviously bad for the environment. And then in terms of the factories, in order to keep those machines moving and running, we created engines, but engines need coal or some kind of heat or fire to keep those engines going. And so you ended up with massive amounts of air pollution. And people had to breathe that stuff in and live in that, and that's the real first instance of smog. And we have even global warming today. So it's hard to say that the impact on the environment of this was little. It was pretty darn negative. So I've made a case and given you some examples of how some of these things have been negative, and that's really what you want to make sure that you do.